Good evening. So today's session will be on some basic computer hardware components along with a little bit of explanation on the software. And the objectives are identified there just to determine some few major computer hardware components, describe the function of each component in a single line or so, and to be able to locate it inside and outside a computer. So a computer is a system that contains various components, various parts, just like you are as a human body. The human body contains various parts, the same with a computer. Whenever you say this is a system, it means it will have this component. So these parts are usually referred to as hardware. And they usually work together to do those four main things: accept data, store data, process the data, and then give the output. Because there are components which are responsible for just inputting data, like the keyboard, mouse. And then there are components which are responsible for data storage. There are components which are responsible for processing. And then there are components which are responsible for giving output. But there are others which do not do either of those, but they are also part of them. For example, we'll see. So the hardware can be grouped into those four major components or parts or devices. This one we have already seen this session in our previous presentation. We have input devices. Example of an input device is what? Mouse. Example of a processing device, CPU, storage device, we have a lot of them, and output device, projector, printer, and so on and so on. So these diagrams represents a typical computer showing its various parts, as you can see. It's labeled A to J, but there are more than this. These are just basic, because to your level, you don't need to know each and everything. So we'll see these parts and probably one or two which have not been labeled. So the first part is called power supply unit, abbreviated as PSU. Here the power supply unit is shown with the letter A, this one. As the name indicates, it's responsible for receiving power from external electricity, like from the socket. Once it is received, it is processed, converts it, so that it can be distributed to other parts of the computer. So converts electricity from a wall socket, that is electricity from the outside, into usable power for computer components. So its function are those three: supplies power to the motherboard, supplies power to the hard disk, to the RAM, and other devices. That is the first part. Usually it is mounted over here. It is mounted on this one is called computer case. The computer case is the one responsible for storing everything which is you see in here. For example, the power case is within the computer case, that rectangle box. It has got several names. It is sometimes called computer case, or system case, or just case, unit, or system unit. Has got several names. So it is usually mounted there and screwed with some screws. So you can unscrew it or screw it if you want to replace it. Mounted usually at the back. The way to know it, the location where you have that plug, electricity power plug, you plug, that is where it is located inside. So the other one, usually at the top here, is the random access memory, RAM. The random access memory usually will be mounted here. It is not typically there, but there are RAM sockets. So within the RAM sockets, that's where you can insert a random access memory. And whenever you want to insert it, usually you will insert it and then attach it with those attachers. Whenever you want to dislocate it, you usually pull slightly those connectors and then it automatically pops out. You don't need to use much force. So those are called random access memory. It is a temporary memory. It is a storage, but it stores data temporarily, not permanent, during the course of running computer. So whenever you turn the computer on, the RAM, usually the operating system will be stored in the RAM. That is the first thing which it will do. Operating system which was in the hard disk will be placed into the RAM. And then from there, the operating system can take over and manage and control other parts of the computer. So its function is to store data currently being used. For example, at this moment, this Word document is open. So there's a copy within the RAM. It allows other programs to run faster, but it also stores the OS. When we say programs, OS is also part of the program, but the operating system is because it is the main one. So its characteristics stores data temporarily, okay? The term storing data temporarily is usually referred as to volatile. Volatile. Volatile in chemistry means something which can evaporate easily. So it's called volatile because once the power is on, even if this is on, within the memory location, it won't exist anymore. It will be volatile, which is different from the hard disk. So it will lose data when power is switched off. And usually it is faster. So that is the RAM. And then we have the ribbon cable. These are cables within the system case, which are responsible for transmitting to transfer data between one computer component and the other. Because the CPU will usually fetch data from the RAM. So how does it fetch? There has to be a connection in between. So the ribbon cable is the one which does that. Similarly, there are different parts of the component, but mentioning CPU and RAM is just an example. Hard disk and CPU, as you can see here, these ribbon cables connect this hard disk and this RAM. You can see, I think. And then there are also others which would connect from one component to another. For example, the motherboard connector, which I don't see it here, but that is the function of the what? Of the ribbon cable. So connect storage devices, that's the first thing, and then transfer data. The whole aim of connecting the storage devices is so that data can be transferred back and forth from one component and the other. You will know a ribbon cable it is usually large and flat like this one. This is called the ribbon cable. And then the other one, which will be the fifth one, is the hard disk drive. This is common. This is a permanent storage device. Within here, this is a hard disk drive, D. So whenever the power goes off, the data will not be lost with the hard disk drive. So it stores operating systems even when the power is off. Stores other documents like video. Any document which you save will be automatically saved in the hard disk. So its characteristics is permanent storage, which is different from the RAM, which is temporary. And the data remains off when power is off. These two things are the same. Permanent storage and the data remains even when power, they are the same thing. It is just a different way of wording it, okay? Another characteristic is that its speed is less compared to RAM. Has less speed, but its capacity is more. Can store more. Kwenye RAM, storage ni ndogo because it's just temporary. With hard disk, you would expect a hard disk to have more capacity storage than a RAM. And then we have the CPU, which is referred to as the brain of the computer because it is responsible for performing different mathematical calculations and logical calculations. That's why it's called CPU. So without CPU, actually not even CPU, even without the RAM, the computer can, here the computer cannot process data without CPU, okay? It will be usually located in here. In our case, the CPU is inside this fan. This is a CPU fan, so within inside. In the past, usually they didn't have fans. So the CPU was just like, but because of the heating effects and they decided to have a fan so that it can be cooling that CPU so that it can be more effective. So this is not a CPU, it is a CPU fan, but it is within, inside this fan, embedded there. Then we have the keyboard. We have covered the keyboard in details. So it is an input device. It contains how many components, the keyboard, do you recall? How many? Can you mention them? The first one, alphanumerical. The second one, function keys, F1 up to F12. And the third one, navigation. The other one, special keys and numerical keys. You should know the function of each. We covered those in details. So its function is to enter data, text, commands, and other characters like figures, whatever. And then we have the speaker. These are external. We can't mention all of them. We just picked, because if we wanted all of them, we could have included the printer, the fax, the what? Projector. So we just mentioned a few. And then the speaker is the 7th or 8th. Obviously, the mouse, I haven't put the mouse here. The mouse has not been written, but it is also part of it. We'll discuss it just, it is there, G. We haven't reached the G yet, I think. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. G is a number 8. Okay. But here, okay, speaker. This is an output device, and its function is produce sound, play music, and video audio. I think everybody of you know what a speaker is. And then we have several slots, not just RAM slots. Here, RAM slots is just for elaboration. The RAM slots, these are slots which are responsible for inserting a RAM. A location where a RAM can be stored. Kwa sababu, not every slot can fit every device. So it's called RAM slots because it is the one which can insert a RAM, these ones. So for that matter, we even have CPU slots, which are inside the location where CPU can be hosted. We even have other printer slots and then and so on and so on. So whenever you want to insert a device within the motherboard, there has to be a slot for it. So mentioning RAM slot is just for an example, but we have several slots. Is a connector on the motherboard where RAM can be installed. So when we say CPU slots, is a connector on the motherboard where CPU can be installed. So it's holding the RAM modules. In other places, the modules, they call it RAM chips, okay? And it's also correct RAM to the motherboard. Yeah, and then we have these expansion slots, PCI slots. These are slots, connector used to add extra device. For example, graphics card, the network sound card, and so on and so on. TV cards with modern computers and so on. So they have those expansion capabilities if you want to, you need those. And then we have the monitor, output device, displays text, images, and displays video. But with the modern monitors, the modern monitors also have that ability of input. They can also act as input device. These modern screens, for example, your screens on the phone, it can act also as an input device. That's why you can scroll down and up, okay? So in other authors, if you see that a monitor unless if it is named otherwise. But it was mentioned monitor screen, they're the same thing. So it can act as an input. Traditionally, it is an output device, but currently it can act as an input device, but also it can act as an output device. So these are the summary of what everything does. I will add something within these contents. We also have, as I said, system unit or case, system case. These are the ones which are used to host or to hold several computer components within. For example, these RAM slots and the RAM itself, CPU, the hard disk, and other components are within, even the motherboard, they are within that system case. And then it is covered to avoid dust or other impurities from, even for protection purpose, from getting into there. And then we also have the motherboard, which is the main circuit board. This motherboard, whenever you have it, is usually installed within the system case and then screwed. Usually it will have 4 or 6 screws. It is attached to that what? To the system unit, and then that one will hold other components. So the system case indirectly holds the motherboard and other devices, but the motherboard is the one which actually holds those things, okay? Which has not been mentioned in here. The mouse has not been mentioned, so the mouse is just like the keyboard. It is the secondary input device. The primary input is the keyboard, the main one, okay? So this one is also input to point things and other things. For right-clicking, left-clicking, to accept commands, and so on and so on. So that will end our first part. Let's go to the next part before I invite some questions. Let's see some categories of computer software. I know we have done this, but this will complement whatever we didn't cover. The software will usually be divided into system software, application software, utility, and programming software. But with the other authors, they would just take the first two. The utility and programming would be under system. So in other sources, you will see that it's categorized into system and application, end of the story. But in others, they will just say system, application, utility, end of it. In others, they would say those 4. It doesn't matter. So with the system software, they manage all the hardware and provide a platform for application software. So they manage all the resources, including those application software. So it controls the computer operations, manage every resource you know within the computer. Memory, files, printer, even the projector, and so on and so on. These are examples of system software. Obviously, the system software, the operating system itself. Operating system is a typical example, is the main system software, okay? So at times, they are used interchangeably. But an operating system is a system software, okay? The most important system software, which does the same things which we have mentioned above, to start the computer and manage all the other resources. These are examples you can see they have been repeated. Windows, Microsoft Windows, Linux, Ubuntu, Linux, the same thing. And then we have device drivers, software that allows the OS to communicate with hardware devices. So with each device, it will have its own driver. Drivers are special types of software that are used to enhance a certain device. For example, within a printer, we have printer drivers. They are used to connect with the OS so that they can function properly. Scanner drivers. So whatever, printer drivers, and so on and so on. So without it, they may not work properly. And at times, they may need to be updated. And then we have utility software. They are used to enhance or optimize the performance of a computer We mentioned some of them last time, for example, the antivirus, and so on and so on and so on. Protect computers, clean unwanted files, backup, and these are all called utility. The computer can work without them, but at times they may get a hard time of working. For example, if you don't have an antivirus software and the virus enters into a system, the computer might stop working because it is contaminated. So antivirus software is a typical example of what? Utility software. And these are its jobs. These are examples of antivirus software, which are a lot. And then we have application software. They are there to perform specific tasks, creating documents, calculations, example, Excel, creating documents like Microsoft Word, browsing the internet, that will be, which software would be used? Browser. Playing multimedia, which one would you use? You don't know multimedia? Yeah? VLC, MP3, MP4, MP5, whatever. So these are some of the examples. And then we have specialized software. These are for specific tasks. For example, those hospital management system. These are for specialized tasks within an organization. Here in SUA, we have the SWASIS. Yeah? Does it still have that name, SWASIS, or is SWARIS? Yeah, the one which you go and see your marks. That is specialized because it's special for SUA. So in UD, they will have their own SWARIS. It is called ARIS, whatever. It has its own name. When you go to UDOM, it will have its own name and so on and so on. And then we have the programming software used to create computer programs. These are some of the examples of programming language. Python is another example of a programming language. So this is the summary, and it will mark the end of this. So if there are any questions, you are welcome to ask. Yes?
What is the difference between RAM and hard disk?
Oh, the difference between RAM and hard disk drive. Okay. RAM, as we said, stores data temporarily, okay? If this computer is turned off abruptly without closing, this document at this moment is stored within the RAM. But if you turn your computer off without closing it, it will not exist in the RAM. It will be lost. But within the hard disk, we expect it to be available. So this is just a copy. Within the hard disk, there's another copy, the permanent copy. If you make changes and accept changes, that copy will also be changed. So with RAM, it will store data temporarily. And then the hard disk, usually it stores data on a permanent base, okay? Now, this difference occurs because of the materials used to create the RAM and the what? And the hard disk. The RAM is, among the components, the RAM, it consists of capacitors, okay, and transistors. It is made up of many small capacitors and transistors. Do you know how a capacitor operates, by the way? One of the characteristics of a capacitor is that it loses charge easily. You know that, you learned in physics. A capacitor has the property of losing charge easily. Okay? So, for example, consider this as a RAM. Just as an example. These are RAM cells. Cells means those spaces. So, we consider these to be made up of a lot of capacitors. Okay? Now, when you store something within the RAM, it is usually stored in terms of ones and zeros. Okay? For example, an A would be stored in terms of maybe 1, 0, 0, 1. Just as an example. This is not an A, but just an example. Okay? So, 1 will be identified by the capacitor being on, and 0 will be identified by the capacitor being off. Okay? But as we said, that the capacitor will usually lose charge easily. So, every now and then, even if the electricity is on, this will be off. So there will be another component which will be refreshing it so that it comes on. That's why it's called dynamic RAM. We say dynamic RAM because when this is on, maybe this is like this, it means this capacitor now it is charging, this is not charging. That is how 1 and 0 are identified within the system. But always, when it is 1 here, it has to be refreshed every now and then so that that one is maintained. And hence the term dynamic. Dynamic means these cells are every once and then they are refreshed. Those ones which are called static RAM, they don't need to be refreshed, but they are very expensive, okay? So these components are the ones which make the RAM work. So when you turn it off, what happens? These capacitors will turn off and you lose that data. Because the components, they are made of components which naturally, they lose electricity easily, okay? And those data which you save, they are determined by the capacitor being on. It is not that there's a 1 here, no. When the capacitor is on, just like whenever you turn on the light, it is 1 when the light is on and 0 when it is off. When you do calculations, maybe in those what? Logic, I don't know if you did advanced mathematics, logic and electrical networks. 1, 1, 0, and then the light, that 1 means the light is on. It is not that there's a 1 there. And then it is off when it is off. You see, when you turn it off, that it goes off immediately. When you turn it on, it goes on immediately. Same like this, okay? So the materials which are made from that RAM are the ones which cause it to lose data easily, to evaporate, which is different from a hard disk. A hard disk is usually made up of platters. And those platters, they are basically small particles of magnets, which for them, even when the electricity, so whenever you want to change a 1 or 0, they are realigned. Maybe if it is 1, that magnet will align itself like this. When it is 0, it will align itself with this, and so on and so on. But when it is turned off, that alignment will not change. And hence, it will be maintained. The RAM loses data, loses electricity because of the nature of the materials it is made. It is capacitor and transistors which lose electricity. The hard disk doesn't because of the material they are made of. So when you say RAM is volatile, that's the reason. Okay? Yes?
About this storage is so nowadays you find some of computers using the SSD. Some of computers nowadays are using these solid state drivers instead of hard disk drivers in storing the information. So what are the difference between these two terms in storage? And what happens if you go there to find the computer to buy, you find a SSD having a small capacitors, I can say the ability to hold
storage,
small,
like
but
it too.
you find it is high price compared to HDD, which have the little chance to hold the data but having the small value in the market.
How much does this SSD cost? I haven't done my research much. Maybe you can give us experience. How much did it cost? The one you bought had what was the capacity? The one you bought?
It's about
256 megabytes or terabytes? And it was 350,000. Which is compared with if you have, well, I'm not sure about that answer, but one of the things, I haven't done research, but I will try to make the best guess which I can. There are factors which would cause a storage device its price to be up or down. The first factor is storage capacity. If the storage is high, everything being equal, we expect it to be high, okay? But another thing is speed. Under normal circumstances, a RAM is more expensive than a hard disk because a RAM has more speed. But when we compare a hard disk against a hard disk, as I said, That one, the hard disk, the traditional hard disk had what? Less price, okay? Compared to SSD, which had. Was this an external or the internal? So the reason which I might guess is the portability. Portability, maybe. This is more portable, which is compared to this. I cannot think of anything else. It is easily carried. I will try to check on it, and maybe next week I can give a better answer. But for the moment, the only thing I can think is portability. It can be easily carried. But another thing, it may be that this is more reliable than that one. There's also issue of reliability, that it is made in such a way, maybe it is waterproof. You never know. So a hard disk, if it is contaminated with maybe smoke or sand particles or dust, because of those magnet and smoke, they don't go with each other, or water. That might be another reason, but I will check into it and give a better answer next week. Yeah. Yes.
Why CPU is called the brain? Why CPU is called the brain?
Why CPU is called the brain? Okay, because it performs functions which are similar to the human brain. As we know, human brain would receive to work, can sense human brain. And once it senses, it can process and make decisions. So the CPU also does those similar things. A CPU doesn't sense but accepts data from this RAM, fetches it, okay? And then once it's fetched, it can process it, either doing mathematics or making logical decisions. And then once it can process, it can give output. So it's called because it performs functions which are equivalent or similar, or simulates the human brain. That's why. Okay. Okay, that should mark the end of our session. Thank you for your participation, and we can call it a day.
Chuo Kikuu cha Sokoine cha Kilimo SUA.